So 15 years or so ago, just to give you a sense of how long I might have been engaged with some of this material, but I was facilitating a workshop for mentors at UWA in the Leadership Development for Women program. And when I suggested that mentors, all quite senior people in that group, might actively provide opportunities to their mentees, the mentors were quite resistant. That wouldn't be fair, was their response. I was astonished and I guess intrigued, because it's come up again later in my research. I knew that senior leaders were doing this constantly, putting people's names forward for opportunities, inviting people onto committees, deciding on working party membership, creating acting opportunities, tapping people on the shoulder. It was how the place worked. But I suspect that sponsorship, which is what we would now term the kinds of activities or actions that I've just described, was so unconsciously done and so unquestionably part of everyday university life, and also quite invisible, that the idea of sponsoring deliberately, visibly, selectively, in this case for women, didn't seem right. However, they were certainly happy to take on the role of mentor, talking through career challenges and offering support and advice. Despite their seeming reluctance, what I also observed is that over time, some of those mentors did in fact put women forward for opportunities, adopting the role of sponsor once they were more familiar and confident in their mentees' abilities, and when it was within their sphere of influence to do so. Later on during my PhD research, I identified a mentor, this was in WA Police, who I call Trevor, who was very clear that police women were consistently being overlooked and not being given the opportunities that they actually deserved and needed in order to succeed. And he proactively sought out opportunities for these mentees. And this time it was me that was somewhat resistant to this idea. I was fearful that this would be seen as patronage and reflect poorly on the women's program. So while mentoring is always considered to be good, sponsorship, or that kind of the notion of the provision of opportunity, seems to be much more complex. So it's not embraced in the same way, and what we immediately begin to see is that there's a light and a dark side to it, a shadow side if you like, but also the light side, which is the enabling that we do of other people's careers through the provision of opportunity. So it was 2010 when a very important article came out that I think really sort of catapulted sponsorship more into the public sphere and into public discourse. And it was by Professors Ibarra, Carter and Silver in a Harvard Business Review article that was called Why Men Still Get More Promotions Than Women. And it was research that they had conducted into mentoring, and they concluded that women were over-mentored and under-sponsored. So what they really highlighted was that there were gender differences where the mentors, some were women but mostly men, actually sponsored men and mentored women, and that sponsorship then became the missing ingredient, if you like, for women. So that really provoked some further research, but most of which has occurred in the US and in corporate settings. So that idea of sponsorship, I wasn't really surprised by the findings of the research, and the idea of sponsorship really resonated with me because of the work that I've been doing in mentoring. And I really wanted to know, well, how does this apply in universities? So the research that I've undertaken was really wanting to kind of be a starter into that space of thinking about how does sponsorship work within academia and within universities for professional and academic staff. So my research has focused on academic staff, but I've been engaged in this space now for quite some time and testing out these ideas, and I've certainly worked with professional staff, and there's some differences and some similarities. So just to be clear about what the difference is between mentoring and sponsorship, so everyone immediately thinks sponsorship, it's like who's the financial backer of the football team or whatever, so we have to get past that. One of my interviewees described it as activated mentorship, and I think that actually kind of has quite a nice, it encapsulates it quite nicely. But the way I define it is that sponsorship involves active engagement in the creation of career-enhancing opportunities, while mentoring is that more passive talking with or advising of colleagues with no active intervention on the part of the mentor. So the sponsor then is able to draw on their power, their networks, their resources, their social capital, and their influence on behalf of the other. So an example within academia might be that a mentor would advise you to become a member of the editorial board of a major professional journal in your field, but a sponsor would personally recommend you to the journal editor. So how then does sponsorship work? I'm sure that many of you, in fact probably all of you, like my interviewees, will consider sponsorship to be part and parcel of what you do and what you've received during your careers. Sponsorship, once defined by me, was recognisable and familiar to all of my interviewees, themselves mostly senior people at the University of Western Australia and University of Melbourne. It was interesting to me that when they described the sponsorship practices that they were familiar with, both from their own careers and in terms of the sponsorship they provide for others, they focused very clearly on two main arenas. One was the developing of the research aspect of academic careers, and the other was in terms of developing leaders. So in terms of research, I think we understand that there's some recognisable building blocks early on in academic careers that are reliant really on sponsorship. So that opportunity to present at the conference, the inclusion on grants, the inclusion on an academic paper, having your name put forward, the introduction to key people in your discipline, in your field, even the negotiation of postdoc positions and so on. Many of these activities need to happen close to home within the discipline base. And they really show, I think, how critical sponsorship is in terms of the launching of the research aspect of academic careers. I'd like to be able to say they also talked about teaching, but that's not actually the case. So it does seem that the research aspect of academic careers is the part where that active sponsorship is really required. And of course it doesn't stop in the later stages of careers. The point was made that even for the Nobel Prize there's sponsorship that's going on behind the scenes. So it's there throughout people's careers, but certainly seems to be essential in launching careers. In terms of leadership, the leaders were very aware of their need to develop the next group of leaders, and they did that through providing endorsement, making people visible, providing opportunities to develop leadership through deputy roles, secondments, positions on committees, working parties, high-profile projects, and so on. And what I was aware of is that there was both quite small and incremental, I guess, acts of sponsorship, and also quite large career-defining aspects or acts of sponsorship that they were referring to. So then the picture that gets built up in these careers, or the role of sponsorship, is that it's critical to careers, and that it in fact builds up kind of a virtuous cycle where one opportunity in effect leads to the next and the next. So the opportunity provision provides validation to the person. If they make good use of that opportunity, it increases their confidence, it increases their visibility, they're able to accrue merit, if you like, and it results in successful career progression. The lack of sponsorship, on the other hand, creates a negative spiral, low visibility, lack of access to opportunity, declining confidence, and a lack of a sense of fit. Underperformance relative to perhaps what might have been expected or possible, and a failure to thrive and make their best contribution that can sometimes lead to exit. So sponsorship in this sense, when we think about this, we can think of it as career making and career breaking. And we can also reflect on the sponsors, those with the capacity to provide these opportunities, that they exercise, in our systems at least, a great deal of discretion. In effect, they choose who they're going to sponsor. And if you think about the role that we all can play in terms of sponsorship, particularly those of you with senior positions, you're effectively choosing who will succeed within academia, whose careers will be launched, and who will lead. So this kind of sponsorship as part and parcel then of university life is also problematic. So what we have in our sector is sponsorship that's largely discretionary and informal. It's an everyday practice, and of course it's also a legitimate practice. It's necessary for development. But as my interviewees described it, it happens largely under the radar, it's not necessarily transparent, and people are not held accountable for who and how they sponsor. So what we have here is kind of a lot of possibility for unconscious bias to come into play in these everyday practices. And this is in fact what I could see in my interviewees' accounts, and particularly in terms of affinity bias. And people were quite upfront about sponsoring people that they liked, people that they got to know well. The other kind of bias that I saw was what I would refer to as kind of a linear career bias, that it's easier to sponsor those who are able to step out the kind of career that we might think of as more normative, and that it's less risky for the sponsor to do this. So in that sense, sponsorship can be a replicatory process, a kind of senior people choosing to sponsor people like me who can have a career like mine. On the more positive side, what I also saw is interviewees who were aware of the power that they had as sponsors, who used it in creative ways, who went out of their way to sponsor people who were not like them, and who might be in some ways able to break the mould. And I also discovered groups, leaders and groups of people who had just amazing mentoring and sponsorship practice, highly refined practices where they were really inclusive of everyone in their team and everyone or in their group or their lab or their centre, and how effective this was in terms of research productivity in particular. And there were others who just through having to talk about their sponsorship practices started to reflect during the interviews about, maybe I need to give this a little bit more thought. So I just wanted to talk about why I think this naming of sponsorship and differentiating it from mentoring is so important as we move forward, now that we have this as part of kind of the research base that's being built up. So I think we're able now to name a cluster of everyday practices that are critical to career success. And in doing so, we're able to shine a spotlight on a key mechanism that's actually contributing to gender inequity and to gender inequitable outcomes. So there's really then a power in naming sponsorship, in making it discussable, in making it visible, making it notable, bringing it out into the open, if you like, and open to scrutiny. When we do so, we're also more able to identify gaps. When we talk about mentoring, we're not necessarily able to identify sponsorship gaps, the absence of sponsorship in people's careers. And when we've done so in the past, when we've identified the gaps, we've thought that mentoring was the answer, and maybe it's only a partial solution, or perhaps it's not going to fill the gap at all. So it actually leads to different thinking about interventions and solutions. And I think it also helps to undermine the idea of a self-made career. We can only really think of people's success if we kind of make the mentoring and sponsorship they've received invisible. If we think about sponsorship, then I think we can become aware of how successful careers take place within a community of enabling relationships. And in fact, that's what we all can provide for each other. And it puts the emphasis on cultures. It puts the emphasis a lot actually on leadership in the cultures that people create. And it helps us to think about our own roles and the roles of colleagues. So for me, sponsorship has been sort of endlessly fascinating, because it takes me into all of these different areas where I think we can intervene in really creative ways to build more gender equitable and inclusive and innovative workplaces. So I've been able to use this material in working with heads of department, for example, in working with mentors to think about their informal mentoring and sponsorship practices, in working with early career academics. I've found that when I present the material to women's groups, there's quite a few aha kind of moments where women start to really understand more about these invisible practices, important ways for them. And I think it's going to be really useful for us as we think about Athena Swan and some of what we start to put in place for those organisations involved in that in terms of interventions and action plans. So I'm now writing Chapter 7, which is all about what we as leaders can do, what organisations can do, what we can do in terms of development programs. But I think it does all start with us. And I think the first thing really is to be able to acknowledge our capacity to sponsor and to increase our reflexivity around that, to ask, well, who do I sponsor and why, and who don't I sponsor and why not? And then, of course, it links into unconscious bias, that we not only think about bias in terms of recruitment practices and formal practices, but we really look at informal practices and unconscious bias. It helps us to think about leadership development. And I think also in terms of research productivity and performance, the examples I have of sponsorship that seem to set up highly successful groups of people, I think is another kind of entree point to thinking about how we could use this in universities. I think we can also recognise visibility. Making people visible is a really important and in terms of women's leadership development. So what we also can see, or what I can see in my interviews, is that people who've been less well sponsored understand less about sponsorship and are less able to sponsor, and that's a gap that we need to fill. So clearly I could go on, but I think I've well and truly had the nod. But I think what I would like to do is infect you a little bit with my enthusiasm for sponsorship and where that can take us. But also it provides a little bit of a different lens or a different way of thinking about career success. And then I think about how institutions can make the best use of their talent. So to me, it's kind of provided a window into thinking about mentoring and sponsorship differently and what we might be able to do with that.